Captain Jake Morrison adjusted his oxygen mask as the F-22 Raptor sliced through the morning sky at 30,000 feet. The radio crackled with mission briefings, but his mind wandered to the classified folder sitting in his locker back at Nellis Air Force Base. 3 months had passed since Colonel Marcus Frost, his former flight instructor and mentor, had been court-martialed for allegedly selling classified aviation technology to foreign agents. The evidence seemed overwhelming: encrypted files on his personal computer, unexplained deposits in offshore accounts, and testimony from a trusted intelligence operative. Jake had testified at the hearing, forced to recount conversations where Frost had expressed frustration with military bureaucracy and budget cuts. The man who had taught him everything about flying, who had saved his life during a training accident, who had been like a father to him, was now serving a 20-year sentence in military prison. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of their personal relationship, but because it shattered Jake's faith in the system he had sworn to protect. The mission today was routine patrol along the Pacific coastline, monitoring for any unusual aircraft activity. Jake's wingman, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, flew in perfect formation beside him, her voice steady over the comm as she reported their position to ground control. Below them, the ocean stretched endlessly, dotted with commercial shipping lanes and the occasional fishing vessel. It was the kind of assignment that allowed too much time to think, to replay conversations and wonder if he had missed warning signs. Had Frost really been a traitor, or had he been framed by someone with deeper connections and better resources? The question haunted Jake daily, especially since Frost's wife had lost their family home, and his teenage daughter had been forced to transfer schools due to harassment from other military families. Ground Control's voice cut through his thoughts with urgency. Raptor 1 and 2, we have an unidentified aircraft approaching restricted airspace, bearing 270, altitude climbing through 25,000 feet. Intercept and identify. Jake's training kicked in immediately, pushing personal concerns aside as he banked left toward the target. His radar screen painted a clear picture: a small aircraft, probably civilian, flying directly toward a classified military installation. Such violations happened occasionally, usually involving lost private pilots or aircraft with navigation failures, but protocol demanded immediate response. The rules of engagement were clear: establish visual contact, attempt radio communication, and if necessary, force the aircraft to land at a designated airfield. As they closed the distance, Jake could see the aircraft clearly, a modified Cessna Citation, flying with unusual precision for a civilian pilot. Something about its flight pattern seemed deliberate, almost military in nature. He attempted radio contact on emergency frequencies, but received no response. The aircraft continued its approach toward the restricted zone, now less than 10 miles from the perimeter. Jake's finger hovered over the weapon systems, hoping it wouldn't come to that. Protocol dictated that if the aircraft entered the restricted airspace and failed to respond to warnings, they would be authorized to use force. He had never had to shoot down a civilian aircraft, and the thought made his stomach tighten. But orders were orders, and the installation below contained some of the military's most sensitive research projects. The Cessna suddenly banked hard right, as if finally noticing the F-22s flanking it. Jake breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the pilot had finally seen reason. But instead of turning away from the restricted zone, the aircraft began a complex evasive maneuver that no civilian pilot should have known. His blood ran cold as he recognized the pattern. It was a tactical formation Frost had taught him years ago, designed to confuse radar-guided missiles. Only a handful of pilots knew that specific sequence, and most of them were either dead or still serving in classified units. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Either this was an incredible coincidence, or Marcus Frost was somehow involved in this incursion. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip on the controls. The aircraft below was now definitely heading for the restricted zone, and his orders were clear. But if Frost was somehow connected to this, then maybe the court-martial had been wrong. Maybe his mentor had been framed, and this was his way of trying to expose the truth. Or maybe Jake was seeing patterns that weren't there, desperate to believe that the man who had shaped his career wasn't really a traitor. The radio crackled again with ground control demanding an update, but Jake found himself hesitating for the first time in his military career. The next few minutes would determine not just the fate of the mysterious aircraft, but possibly his own future as well. Lieutenant Chen's voice came through the comm, professional but tinged with concern. "Jake, we need to make a decision. That aircraft is 30 seconds from the restricted zone." She was right, of course. Personal feelings had no place in a tactical situation, and he was endangering both of them by hesitating. But something about the way the Cessna was flying, the precision of its movements, the timing of its approach, it all felt too deliberate to be a simple violation. Jake made a decision that would either vindicate his instincts or end his career. Instead of engaging immediately, he decided to shadow the aircraft and see where it was really heading. The Cessna crossed into restricted airspace, and Jake's radio exploded with urgent commands from ground control. "Raptor 1, you are cleared to engage. Repeat, you are cleared to engage the target." But Jake noticed something else. The aircraft was heading not toward the main installation, but toward a smaller, seemingly abandoned hangar on the far side of the complex. It was a building he recognized from his early training days, one that had been supposedly decommissioned years ago. As they approached, Jake could see vehicles parked around the hangar, expensive cars that didn't belong to military personnel, and figures moving between the shadows. Something was definitely wrong, and it wasn't the Cessna that was the real threat. The mystery aircraft began its descent toward a small runway Jake hadn't even known existed. As they flew overhead, he caught a glimpse of the pilot through the cockpit window, a figure in a military flight suit, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged there. But it was what he saw painted on the aircraft's tail that made his heart stop. There, barely visible in the morning light, was a small frost crystal symbol, the same marking Frost had painted on his personal aircraft. The same symbol he had taught Jake represented precision, clarity, and the ability to see through deception. It was Frost's personal signature, and seeing it here meant that either his mentor had somehow escaped from military prison, or someone was using his symbols to send a message. Jake's mind raced as he watched the Cessna touch down on the hidden runway. The vehicles around the hangar were moving now, and he could see armed figures taking positions. This wasn't a simple airspace violation. This was some kind of operation, and from the looks of it, it was about to turn violent. His radio crackled with increasingly urgent commands to engage. But Jake found himself torn between duty and the growing suspicion that he was witnessing something far more complex than a simple security breach. The frost symbol on the aircraft's tail seemed to mock him, a reminder of lessons learned and trust betrayed, but also a possible clue to a puzzle he had never fully understood. Lieutenant Chen's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp with concern. "Jake, what are you doing? Ground control is ordering immediate engagement." She was right to be worried. By failing to follow direct orders, Jake was risking not just his career, but potentially a court-martial of his own. But something about the situation felt orchestrated, as if he was meant to be here, meant to see this. The frost symbol, the precise flying, the hidden runway, it all pointed to a larger conspiracy that had somehow ensnared his mentor. Jake made another decision that would change everything. Instead of engaging the aircraft, he requested permission to land and investigate, knowing that his career hung in the balance. Ground Control's response was immediate and furious. "Raptor 1, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Do not attempt to land." But Jake was already beginning his descent, following the same approach path the Cessna had taken. He could see figures running between the buildings now, and the glint of weapons in the morning sun. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than a simple airspace violation, and the frost symbol on that aircraft was the key to understanding it all. As his landing gear touched down on the hidden runway, Jake realized he had just committed an act that would either expose a massive conspiracy or end his military career forever. The hangar doors began to open as Jake taxied his F-22 toward the building, his weapons systems still armed, but his intent focused on answers rather than destruction. Through his canopy, he could see the Cessna parked nearby, its pilot nowhere to be seen. The frost symbol on its tail was clearly visible now, painted with the same precision and care that Frost had always demanded in everything he did. Jake's hands moved automatically through the shutdown procedures, but his mind was focused on what he might find inside that hangar. Years of training had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he had was screaming that Marcus Frost had been framed, and that the truth was waiting somewhere in the shadows of this supposedly abandoned facility. As the canopy opened and Jake climbed down from his aircraft, he was immediately surrounded by armed figures in civilian clothes. They moved with military precision, but their equipment and coordination suggested they were something more than standard security. Jake kept his hands visible but ready, his sidearm still holstered but easily accessible. The leader of the group, a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes, stepped forward with a slight smile. "Captain Morrison, we've been expecting you. Your mentor said you would figure it out eventually." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. If these people knew about his connection to Frost, then this whole situation had been orchestrated from the beginning. But the question remained, was Frost a willing participant, or had he been manipulated into whatever was happening here? The man gestured toward the open hangar doors, where Jake could see sophisticated equipment and what appeared to be a makeshift command center. "Colonel Frost is inside, waiting to explain everything. But I should warn you, what you're about to learn will change everything you believe about loyalty, duty, and the people you've sworn to serve." Jake's mind raced as he weighed his options. He could try to fight his way out, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. He could wait for backup, but Lieutenant Chen was probably already heading back to base, and ground control would assume he had been shot down. Or he could walk into that hangar and finally get answers to questions that had been haunting him for months. The decision was made for him when a familiar voice called out from the hangar, "Jake, it's safe. Come inside." It was Marcus Frost, alive and apparently free, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had guided Jake through countless training missions. But hearing it now in these circumstances raised more questions than it answered. Jake moved toward the hangar, his escorts flanking him but not restraining him, their weapons lowered but ready. As he stepped through the doorway, Jake saw his former mentor standing beside a bank of computer monitors, dressed in civilian clothes but carrying himself with the same military bearing he had always possessed. The Frost symbol was emblazoned on his shirt, a reminder of the man who had taught Jake everything he knew about flying and honor. "Hello, Jake," Frost said, his voice heavy with an emotion Jake couldn't identify. "I know you have questions, and I know you probably hate me for what you think I did. But everything that happened, everything I was accused of, was part of a larger operation to expose something that goes to the very heart of our military's leadership." Jake stared at his mentor, searching for signs of deception, but finding only the same steady gaze that had always been able to see through his lies and excuses. If Frost was telling the truth, then the court-martial had been a sham, and Jake had been manipulated into testifying against an innocent man. But if Frost was lying, then Jake was now complicit in whatever scheme was unfolding here. The equipment around them was sophisticated beyond anything Jake had seen in regular military installations. Multiple computer screens showed what appeared to be financial records, communication intercepts, and surveillance footage from various military bases. Frost gestured to the displays with a mixture of pride and sadness. What you're looking at is evidence of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of our military leadership. The people who framed me, who destroyed my family and my reputation, have been selling our most sensitive technology to foreign agents for years. I wasn't the traitor, Jake. I was the one who discovered the real traitors. The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring Jake to believe in the man who had once been his hero. Jake studied the evidence displayed on the screens, his trained eye picking out details that suggested authenticity. Financial records showed payments to high-ranking officials. Communication intercepts revealed conversations about technology transfers, and surveillance footage showed meetings between military personnel and known foreign agents. If this evidence was real, then Frost was telling the truth about a conspiracy that dwarfed his own alleged crimes. But Jake had learned to be skeptical of anything that seemed too convenient, too perfectly arranged. "Why didn't you present this evidence at your court-martial?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Frost's expression darkened as he moved to another set of displays. Because the people who were prosecuting me were the same people who were running the conspiracy. My commanding officer, the prosecutor, even the judge, they were all part of it. Any evidence I tried to present was either dismissed or mysteriously disappeared from the record. They needed a scapegoat, someone to take the fall for their crimes, and I was the perfect choice. A decorated officer with access to classified technology, but not enough political connections to protect myself. The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, but Jake could also hear the pain of a man who had been betrayed by the institution he had served faithfully for decades. The implications of what Frost was saying were staggering. If true, it meant that Jake had been manipulated into helping destroy an innocent man's life, and that the real traitors were still in positions of power. But it also meant that whatever was happening here was incredibly dangerous, and that Jake was now a target simply by knowing the truth. "So what's your plan?" Jake asked, gesturing to the equipment around them. "You can't expose this conspiracy from a secret hangar. Eventually, they'll find you, and when they do, you'll disappear completely." Frost smiled grimly, the expression Jake remembered from their most dangerous training missions. "That's where you come in," Frost said, moving to a secure communications terminal. I've been gathering evidence for months, but I need someone with active military access to help me get it to the right people. Someone who can't be easily dismissed or silenced. Someone whose reputation and service record are beyond question. Jake felt a chill as he realized what his mentor was asking. You want me to risk my career, my freedom, my life, to help you expose this conspiracy. But how do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know this isn't just an elaborate justification for your crimes? The question hung between them, years of trust and betrayal crystallizing into this single moment of decision. Frost moved to a locked cabinet and withdrew a file folder, its contents secured with multiple classification stamps. Because I have something that proves my innocence beyond any doubt, something that will not only clear my name but expose the real traitors and save countless American lives. He handed Jake the folder, its weight seeming to represent far more than just paper and ink. But once you open that file, there's no going back. You'll know the truth, and they'll know you know. Your life will never be the same. Jake stared at the folder, his hands trembling slightly as he considered the implications. Everything he had believed about honor, duty, and justice was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. The radio in Jake's aircraft crackled to life, Lieutenant Chen's voice urgent with concern. Jake, are you okay? Ground control is scrambling additional units to your position. You need to get out of there now. The outside world was closing in, and Jake had only moments to decide whether to trust his mentor or turn him into the authorities. Frost watched him with the same patient expression he had worn during their most difficult training exercises, waiting for Jake to make the choice that would define both their futures. The Frost symbol on Frost's shirt seemed to pulse with meaning, a reminder of lessons about clarity and precision that had guided Jake's entire career. Jake opened the file folder, his eyes scanning the contents with growing amazement and horror. Inside were photographs, documents, and recorded conversations that painted a picture of corruption that reached into the highest levels of military leadership. The Secretary of Defense, multiple generals, and dozens of other high-ranking officials were all implicated in a scheme that had been selling American military technology to foreign agents for over a decade. But what made Jake's blood run cold was the realization that he had been used as an unwitting pawn in their plan, his testimony helping to frame Frost, while the real traitors continued their operations. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and absolutely damning to some of the most powerful people in the American military. "My God," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of approaching aircraft. "This is real, all of it. They really did frame you." Frost nodded grimly, his expression showing both vindication and sorrow. "The question now is what we do about it. I've been gathering this evidence for months, but I need someone with active military access to help me get it to the right people. someone who can't be easily dismissed or silenced. Outside, Jake could hear the roar of jet engines as additional F-22s arrived to surround the facility. Time was running out, and he had to make a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of American military security itself. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Jake could see through the hangar windows that the facility was now surrounded by military vehicles, and he could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching. Lieutenant Chen's voice continued to crackle over the radio, her concern growing with each unanswered transmission. "Jake, if you can hear me, you need to know that ground control is treating this as a hostile situation. They're ordering shoot to kill if you don't surrender immediately." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. The realization that he was now considered a traitor by the very people he had sworn to protect. But the evidence in his hands made it clear that the real traitors were the ones giving the orders. Frost moved to another terminal and began downloading files onto a secure drive. "I've been preparing for this moment for months," he said, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "This drive contains everything, all the evidence, all the proof of innocence, all the documentation of the real conspiracy. But getting it to the right people won't be easy. The people we're fighting have resources we can't imagine, and they won't hesitate to kill us both to protect their secrets." Jake watched his mentor work, seeing the same focused intensity he had always brought to their training missions. But this wasn't a training exercise. This was a fight for their lives and their country's security. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hangar as armed figures began to take positions around the building. Jake could see muzzle flashes through the windows, and he realized that the civilian contractors who had surrounded him earlier were now engaged in a firefight with the military units outside. The situation was rapidly deteriorating into chaos, and Jake found himself caught in the middle of a battle between forces he couldn't entirely identify. "We need to get out of here," he said, checking his sidearm and looking for alternative exits. But Frost seemed strangely calm, as if he had been expecting this exact scenario. "There's one more thing you need to know," Frost said, finishing his file transfer and pocketing the secure drive. "The reason I chose this location, the reason I led you here, is because this facility is connected to an underground tunnel system that leads to a small airfield about 5 miles from here. I have an aircraft waiting there, and if we can reach it, we can get this evidence to people who will actually act on it." Jake stared at his mentor, wondering how many other secrets he had been keeping, and how long he had been planning this elaborate escape. The frost symbol on Frost's shirt seemed to mock him with its implications of hidden depths and concealed truths. The firefight outside was intensifying, and Jake could hear the distinctive crack of sniper rifles mixing with the rapid fire of automatic weapons. Through the hangar windows, He could see the bodies of several contractors lying motionless on the ground, their expensive equipment scattered around them. But he could also see military personnel taking casualties, and he realized that the people who had been guarding this facility were far better trained and equipped than they had initially appeared. "Who are these people?" Jake asked, gesturing toward the ongoing battle. "Are they working with you or against you?" Frost's expression grew grave as he moved toward a concealed door in the back of the hangar. "They're military intelligence operatives who have been investigating the same conspiracy I've been tracking. Some of them are loyal to the Constitution. Others are loyal to the people who framed me. The problem is, from where we're standing, it's impossible to tell which is which." Jake followed his mentor toward the hidden door, his mind reeling from the implications. If Frost was telling the truth, then the American military was essentially at war with itself, with different factions fighting over the control of classified technology and the fate of national security. The hidden door opened to reveal a staircase leading down into darkness, the walls lined with what appeared to be communication cables and electrical conduits. Frost pulled out a flashlight and began descending the stairs, his movements sure and confident despite the chaos erupting above them. Jake followed, his hand resting on his sidearm as he tried to process everything that had happened in the past hour. The frost symbol that had led him to this moment seemed to be everywhere now, etched into the walls, painted on equipment, even worked into the pattern of the electrical cables. It was as if his mentor had been preparing for this day for years, leaving clues and symbols that only someone who knew him well would recognize. The tunnel system was more extensive than Jake had imagined, with multiple passages branching off in different directions. Frost led him through the maze with practiced ease, his flashlight beam revealing storage rooms filled with equipment, communication centers, and what appeared to be living quarters for a small team of people. "How long have you been planning this?" Jake asked, his voice echoing in the narrow passages. "How long have you been preparing for this moment?" Frost's answer was barely audible over the sound of their footsteps, but it sent chills down Jake's spine. "Since the day they arrested me, I knew that eventually the truth would come out, and I wanted to be ready." They emerged from the tunnel system into a small hangar built into a hillside, its entrance cleverly concealed by natural vegetation and artificial camouflage. Inside, Jake could see a small twin-engine aircraft, its engines already running and its pilot waiting in the cockpit. The frost symbol was painted prominently on the aircraft's nose, a declaration of identity that made Jake's heart race with a mixture of hope and fear. "This is it," Frost said, his voice filled with determination. "This is our chance to expose the truth and clear my name. But once we take off, there's no going back. We'll be fugitives from the very military we've spent our lives serving." Jake stared at the aircraft, his mind wrestling with the decision before him. Everything he had believed about honor, duty, and justice was being challenged by the evidence he had seen and the situation he now found himself in. His radio crackled one final time with Lieutenant Chen's voice, desperate and pleading. "Jake, please respond. They're ordering me to return to base, but I can't leave you here. Whatever you're doing, whatever you've discovered, there has to be another way." Her words tore at his heart, but Jake knew that there was no other way. The conspiracy was too deep, too well protected, and too dangerous to expose through normal channels. He climbed into the aircraft beside his mentor, feeling the weight of the evidence file in his hands and the responsibility it represented. As they taxied toward the concealed runway, Jake could see smoke rising from the direction of the first hangar, and he could hear the distant sound of continued gunfire. The battle for the truth was just beginning, and he was no longer sure who were the heroes and who were the villains in this complex game of deception and loyalty. The frost symbol on the aircraft's instrument panel seemed to pulse with meaning, a reminder that sometimes the truth was hidden beneath layers of ice and deception, waiting for someone brave enough to chip away at the surface. As they lifted off into the morning sky, Jake caught a glimpse of Lieutenant Chen's F-22 circling high above, her aircraft banking toward the smoking facility they had just escaped. He hoped she would be safe, hoped she would understand that what he was doing was not betrayal, but the highest form of service to their country. The evidence in his hands represented the possibility of justice, the chance to expose a conspiracy that had corrupted the very institution he had dedicated his life to protecting. The frost symbol on Frost's shirt caught the morning light, a beacon of hope in a world that had suddenly become far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The small aircraft climbed steadily into the clear sky, carrying its precious cargo of evidence and testimony toward an uncertain future. Jake looked down at the landscape below, seeing his country with new eyes, not as a simple matter of good versus evil, but as a complex battlefield where the lines between right and wrong were often blurred beyond recognition. The frost symbol that had started this entire adventure seemed to mock him with its implications of hidden truth and concealed loyalties. But it also offered hope, the possibility that beneath the layers of deception and corruption, the truth could still be found and justice could still be served. Behind them, the sounds of battle gradually faded into the distance, replaced by the steady drone of the aircraft's engines and the weight of responsibility that settled over both men like a heavy blanket. The evidence they carried could change everything, expose the real traitors, clear Frost's name, and restore integrity to the military they both loved. But it could also destroy their lives, make them fugitives from the very system they had sworn to protect, and put everyone they cared about in mortal danger. The frost symbol painted on the aircraft's nose seemed to pulse with the rhythm of their flight, A reminder that sometimes the most important battles were fought not in the sky, but in the shadows where truth and deception waged their eternal war. As they flew toward their destination, a secure location where the evidence could be safely delivered to journalists and investigators who had the courage to publish it, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The frost symbol that had decorated his mentor's aircraft, the same symbol that had led him to question everything he believed about loyalty and justice, had become a beacon of hope in a world that seemed to be crumbling around him. The truth was out there, waiting to be revealed, and Jake was determined to see it through no matter what the cost. The frost symbol on Frost's shirt caught the light one final time, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, clarity and precision could still guide them toward justice.